Uber pled and pleaded with their drivers. Please write to your Georgia congressman because they are about to tax us, and that is not good for anyone. We assure you, please fight on our behalf. Apparently, the drivers just didn't show up to fight on their behalf. Hey everyone, this is Kevin the Apptrepreneur. Happy Sunday. I hope you're all enjoying church, or if you're non-religious, I guess just an extra day off. It is Sunday, so that means there will be a live stream this evening instead of 2 videos this morning. So that should be fun. But anyway, you know how I made like a video and have kind of talked about how Uber and Lyft sent emails to drivers begging to write to their congressman, if they lived in Georgia, to oppose a new tax on rideshare. Guys, they said, this is really bad for passengers. And if it's bad for passengers, it's bad for you. So please call your local congressman. Tell them you oppose this. And apparently, just didn't happen. Because according to this article, Georgia House backs Uber, Lyft, and Airbnb tax collections. I didn't know that Airbnb was a part of this, but I guess they are. So yay, that gives me an extra thing to tag. So here's the article. Whether ride-sharing companies such as Lyft and Uber have to begin collecting sales taxes from customers in Georgia will be decided on the final day of the 2019 session. The Georgia House approved a bill Friday for a second time to force so-called marketplace facilitators out of business, such as rideshare and short-term home rental companies like Airbnb. Let's see here. To collect sales tax from customers. The Senate passed its own version of the bill Friday, only one that exempted taxes on ride. House and Senate leaders will now try to figure out the final details. Friday was the 39th day working of the 40-day session. There is talk that legislators may ultimately add a flat fee to each ride, but whatever happens or doesn't happen will occur Tuesday when lawmakers finish their work for the year. So basically come back Tuesday or Wednesday, depending on when I make the video, and we'll have the final verdict on this. The stakes are high for rideshare companies and their customers. The Georgia Department of Revenue has already billed Uber $22 million for taxes, penalties, and interest it says the company owes from July 2012 through June 2015. Uber, how do you go without paying $22 million in tax? Well, anyway. The measure passed in both chambers are largely the work of House Ways and Means Chairman Brett Harrell, Republicans Neville. Really, it's interesting. You don't normally see Republicans wanting to tax these companies, who said they were in reaction to the U.S. Supreme Court decision last year that reversed a decades-old ruling and backed internet sales tax. Harrell said the sales tax are already owed, but they aren't being collected. A similar case was made last year when legislators passed a bill calling for the collection of sales tax on most internet sales. Quote, this doesn't change a single tax rate, doesn't raise a tax, lower a tax, impose a tax, or repeal a tax, Harrell told colleagues before the House vote on Senate Bill 128, which included the facilitator language that the House had earlier approved another bill. It simply says those online platforms are responsible for collecting and remitting those taxes that are already due, which is interesting because, you know, I mean, granted, I'm not always the most sophisticated when it comes to law. I understand this stuff enough so that when I go to the ballot box every election year, I've got a pretty good idea of what I'm voting for. But it's strange to me because, like, here's the thing. If you're already owed it, if there was a law that says they have to pay the tax, why would you have to make a new bill to collect taxes that you are essentially owed and which a law says you are entitled to? That doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but, you know, whatever. The House approved the bill 97-74, but there was opposition to the rideshare provision. State Representative B. Nguyen, Democrat Atlanta, said the tax, quote, will hurt the most vulnerable Georgians who rely on rideshares to get their places of employment. In Atlanta, she said the provision would amount to an 8.9% sales tax on Uber and Lyft rides. Now, this is interesting so far because here's the thing. I don't want to get too political. During the live streams, people ask me what I think about politicians, and I give fairly vague answers, but I try to stay fair. There's only one person I've outright stated I don't like at all. which is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But otherwise, I voted for both Democrats and Republicans. And yes, by the way, folks, just to let you know, I'm allowed to talk politics on my channel. That doesn't give you permission to come into the chat room and say Bernie 2020, Biden 2020, Trump 2020, or Ryan 2020. You know, you don't get the right to do that. I can do that because it's my channel. But I am fairly in the middle. But one of the things that keeps coming up, and I mean, it's a fair point. People keep saying that, well, you know, the Democrats are on the side of the drivers, and the Republicans are never in the side of the drivers. And yet here in this situation, we have a Republican who's actually going after Uber and a Democrat who is defending Uber. Now, granted, they are defending them on the basis that it will hurt the riders, which, yeah, the riders will pay a little bit more money. I'm sorry, that happens sometimes. But it's interesting that B. Nguyen, it's interesting that I know how to pronounce that, but not some of these other words, will hurt the most vulnerable Georgians who rely on ride shares to get to their places of employment. Yeah, but what about the people who are driving the cars, Miss Nguyen? The people who are making less than minimum wage and are burning out their vehicles and spending money on the gas that they don't have and driving around waiting for a ride and having their rates continuously cut. You know, those are the people who represent you too. Those are the working class too. And yet you are totally ignoring them in this case. Now, granted, it should be noted that the Republican here is not necessarily doing this for the drivers' sake, because the drivers will neither benefit nor get hurt by this tax. They kind of feel like just some money's owed to them, which is, yeah, a very typical Republican response. But it's really just surprising that there's a Democrat here who's like just looking at the rider and not the driver. So again, the next election is going to be very, very interesting on how ride sharing factors into the overall political debate. But let's continue. Some of the other businesses that would be affected by the measure, such as Airbnb, have voiced support for the bill. That's interesting how that Airbnb is doing that. A state estimate said the marketplace facilitator measure could bring in up to $157 million a year in state and local sales tax by fiscal 2024. The Senate on Friday also gave final passage to another measure sponsored by Harrell to increase taxes collected in the new economy. House Bill 182 would lower the monetary amount of online retailers have to sell in Georgia before they must collect taxes from consumers. Now, that's interesting too. What world am I living in? Normally the Republican would be pushing for that to be, well, maybe it's not. Did it actually state that one of the Republicans? Actually, it doesn't state that Republicans are pushing that one, but that's still. Anyway, some big companies such as Amazon had been collecting sales taxes for years, but many retailers had not. The law was written before state received the high court's approval. House Bill 182 would lower the threshold for retailers having to collect and remit the taxes from those making at least $250,000 in sales to $100,000. That means more retailers would have to collect the taxes. The bill also would remove that option that companies send tax notices to customers in lieu of collecting the taxes. Under the bill, they just have to collect the taxes. Seems pretty straightforward to me. Brick and mortar store owners have long said they were at a disadvantage against online retailers who could sell products without the tax. They said that allowed internet retailers to undercut them on pricing products, because it did. Critics say internet sales tax laws stifle innovation and hurt small retailers. Well, no, it doesn't. Everyone's got to pay taxes. That's just the long and short of it. And here's the thing. I've got to pay taxes when I sell stuff on eBay. So if I got to pay taxes, you got to pay taxes. And by the way, I am doing just fine on eBay. I'm not doing Shopify as much anymore, but pretty much all the e-commerce sites out there, including Facebook of all things, I'm doing very well and I'm paying taxes on those. So if I got to pay taxes, then you do too. So here's the interesting thing about all of this. And we're going to talk specifically about the rideshare and the driver aspect of this. Because, you know, a few years ago, when laws like this would come up, it's interesting because Uber and Lyft would always write to drivers, say, hey, we're in this bind, come help us out, tell your local senators that you want this. And every single time, pretty much, the drivers have come to Uber's defense. And I think because of that support, Uber and Lyft defeated a lot of unfavorable legislation against them. Austin, Texas was a very notable exception. But for the most part, legislation never got very far because the drivers, of which there are thousands and many, many thousands, they voice opposition. For that matter, the riders voice opposition as well, as did the companies. So the congressmen and the politicians were always under the belief that, hey, everything seems to be working just fine, hunky-dory. Let's not mess with anything. And yet we're now at the point where this legislation is getting passed more and more. And I think it's because the drivers are not showing up to help them. On the contrary, when Uber and Lyft ask something from the drivers, I've heard drivers who've said, hey, I kind of listened to your video and other people's videos. I wrote to the politicians and said, no, I think you should do this. The drivers are now actively against Uber. And that just shows how bad Uber has mismanaged this situation. Because here's the thing. I get a lot of comments all the time, and I've noticed these are actually popping up more and more frequently, calling me like a snowflake and all that jazz, which it's like, I guess that's your opinion, but I am about as far from a snowflake as possible. I mock snowflakes. I mock safe spaces. My whole thing is like, hey, you grow up, and life isn't fair. I remember a conversation my dad had with me one time when he was telling me, I think I was 10 years old. He was explaining why I thought so differently from the world. And he's like, well, he and my mom, they sat me down and he's like, Kevin, here's why you are different from other people. This is why you think differently. You have something called Asperger's syndrome. It is a form of autism. That means you process things a different way. You see the world differently, and in some ways you are at a disadvantage when it comes to socializing. That's why you had the stutter for all those years, because autism made it hard to learn to speak clearly. That's why you had to have 7 years of speech therapy. You are at a disadvantage in some respects in life. And you know what? The world doesn't care. Nobody cares that you are at a disadvantage. You have to figure this out yourself. That is why I frown on people who want to make things, completely fair, which is ironic, but let me continue. In the sense that sometimes you will be at a disadvantage and life isn't fair. You're going to have to make your own way in life. And I pretty much have done that. I have built myself little businesses, and I have a hard time working with people in the workforce because of my social disabilities. Therefore, I realize I need to create my own businesses at home. And I have created those businesses at home. And with the exception of a part-time job that I take pretty much just to get out of the house, I work alone. That also meant that I was at a disadvantage of dating people, and it created so many disadvantages, but I persevered. Now I've met a wonderful woman. We're going to be married soon. So, that's just how it is. But people have been complaining to me about that, and they said, hey, life isn't fair. Snowflake, get over it. Don't like it, quit. Well, first of all, yeah, I pretty much did quit. I'm not going to be willingly abused by these snakes. But here's the thing. A few years ago, whenever they asked me, hey, oppose this, I opposed it because, hey, you know what? They were treating me great. I felt like a real partner. I was getting paid fair with nights on Surge. I made a lot of extra money. There'd be an occasional bonus quest. I remember when they were saying, hey, if you did 300 rides in LA, you got a $2,000 bonus. Well, I tell you what, I uprooted whatever I was planning that week. I worked 12-hour days. I got those $2,000 bonuses. Now, I'm not asking for a $2,000 bonus every week. I know that's not realistic, and that was a situation where it's like, well, they definitely need drivers there, because why? Who in their sane mind would offer that promotion? But the thing was, I felt like a partner. I felt like I could work with them. And when things like this came up, I defended them. And so did a lot of other people. There were actually very, very few people who wanted to be employees, who wanted to get paid their benefits and stuff. I think the amount of people who actually tried to go after Uber legally was fairly small. You didn't see Uber strikes the way you do now, or protests. And the message boards were all sunny. People would go on the Facebook groups and they would brag about how much they made. And some people made thousands of dollars. And before someone says like, people on YouTube that make $1,000. No. We're talking about people who made like $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 weeks. It was nuts. And now you don't. Now you don't. And the drivers are clearly not defending them. And in fact, I bet when this video goes up, there's going to be a lot of people who comment below. It's like, oh, good. I'm glad they're getting hurt. And then you'll have the more reasonable-minded people who will say, hey, look, I want to hurt Uber, but is this really the way to do it? I mean, more taxes are never good. And I sympathize. But Uber has mismanaged this to such a degree that years ago, protests were not necessary. People didn't feel screwed. You didn't have comments like, if you don't like it, just quit. Because who wanted to quit? I mean, some people, if they quit, it's because they just didn't like doing it, not because they weren't making money. And now this is where we're at. So anyway, there's apparently still a little more to go before this actually becomes like a law. I guess we're going to find out on Tuesday or Wednesday, and then I guess we'll have said all we need to say about this. But in the meantime, what do all of you folks think? Do you agree with this? Do you disagree? I would love to know. So you know the drill. Comment below, like, favorite, share, subscribe. If you enjoy my videos, consider becoming a Patreon member. It's totally optional, of course, but even as little as $1 a day goes a long way to helping the channel run smoothly and to get access to my exclusive Patrons-only blog. Also, don't forget to check out my Apptrepreneur vlogs channel. More vlogs coming soon. And the Apptrepreneur Hangouts on Facebook. And as always, flame responsibly. Have a good one.